Our study for today is based on Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 8, and we will study this book until we get to chapter 2 and verse 16. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 8. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. I will scatter you among the nations. If you are unfaithful. Nehemiah not only believed God's word, he also believed in the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. But if you return to me and obey my commands, verse 9 of Nehemiah 1, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Nehemiah said to the Lord, you said that you would scatter if we disobeyed, and we have disobeyed. You also said that if we turned and came back to you, even if we are cast or exiled to the farthest horizon of the world, you would gather us and bring us back to the land. Nehemiah, friends, believed that the Jews would return to the land. He counted on it, and that is why he prays this way. Verses 10 and 11 of chapter 1 now. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and by your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was a cupbearer to the king. Nehemiah, we saw in these two verses, is willing and wants God to use him. But he is not running ahead of God. He prays about it, you notice. He says, if you want to use me, Lord, I'm making myself available. Notice, when Nehemiah spoke about the king in this prayer, he calls him this man. Grant me favor in the presence of this man. We will see him going to ask the king if he may return to the land. Nehemiah does not want to run ahead of God, and so he goes to God first in prayer. Now we come to chapter 2, and in this chapter we see that Nehemiah requests permission from the king, and he rebuilds Jerusalem after returning to it. He reviews the ruins of the city, and then he encourages the people to build the walls of Jerusalem. Verse 1 of chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. Notice, it is at this particular point where the 70 weeks, as I told you earlier, of Daniel begin in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king. This is an important date in prophecy. This man Nehemiah is a delightful personality, as we are going to see. I would have loved to know him personally. He is the kind of layman that you want to get acquainted with. He has a political job, that of cupbearer to the king. His function is to taste anything brought to the king. For example, if a glass of wine is brought to the king, Nehemiah tastes it first. If he suffers no ill effects, then the king will drink the wine. If not, he will not. His job as cupbearer is dangerous, as you can see. Nehemiah is preparing now to make a request to the king, but he is not quite ready. On this particular day, he does not feel very well. Since he received the bad news about his countrymen, the Jews in the land, he has been fasting, mourning, and praying. The king noticed that Nehemiah was not himself. Now verse 2. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. Nehemiah did not know that his feelings showed. He tried to conceal the way he felt, but apparently he was not able to. So the king asked him a point-blank question. "Why are you sad, Nehemiah? You are not physically ill, so it must be sorrow of heart. Something is troubling you. Tell me what it is." At the king's question, Nehemiah was very much afraid. Verse 3, "But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" City in ruins, gates destroyed by fire. Nehemiah said, "May the king live forever." The cupbearer could always say that wholeheartedly, since he tasted what came before the king. He hoped with all his heart that the king would stay in good health, and he hoped he also would stay in good health. Now Nehemiah blurts out what was troubling him. "Why shouldn't I be sad, O king, my master?" he says. "The city of my fathers, the sepulchres where they are buried, lie in waste, and the gates are destroyed, consumed with fire." Verse 4. The king said to me, "What is it you want?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. The moment the king asks him a question, Nehemiah prays. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that a wonderful lesson that we must learn in our everyday lives, in our interaction with people? When people ask us a question, first shoot out a quick prayer and say what Jesus would have said if he were in my place, and then answer it. So I prayed to the God of heaven. Friends, this is the first verse in this book where the word "so" occurs. This little word "so" will occur 32 times in this book. Nehemiah chooses to use this word as a shortcut to get around a lot of protocol and flowery language that does not mean anything. You will find that this man gets right to the point. He does not like to beat around the bush. He said, "So I prayed to the God of heaven." Right in the presence of the king. The king said to Nehemiah, "So evidently you want to make a request to me. What is it that you want to ask?" Nehemiah shot up a prayer to the God of heaven. It was a brief prayer, and I think it was something like this: "O Lord, help me say the right thing. This is the right moment." Verse 5. "And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, if your servant has found favor in his eyes, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it. If it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight." Nehemiah asked the king to grant him leave of absence, that he might go to Jerusalem and rebuild it. Verse 6. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take? And when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Notice, friends, the question the king asks Nehemiah: "How long will your journey take? And when will you get back?" Finally, it says, "It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time." The king obviously liked Nehemiah. He wanted him to come back. At this point, Nehemiah could go into detail, but he does not. And he simply says, "So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time." You know, friends, if you find favor in the eyes of God, you would find favor in the eyes of man. God says, if you honor me, I will honor you. And when God says it, he will keep it. Verse 7, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. In this verse 7, Nehemiah realized that his trip would be a difficult one in a dangerous country. So he asked the king for letters of introduction and letters of explanation to the governors along the route, so that they would give him protection as he traveled through their lands. Verse 8, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forests. Notice the ingenuity of this man. Notice his complete thoroughness, his presence of mind. The moment the king gives him the right to go, Nehemiah asks him for letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and also to the keeper of the king's forests, Asaph. Give me a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forests, verse 8, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of God, of my God, was upon me, the king granted my requests. Because I honored God, God honored me. Now Nehemiah trusted the Lord, but as a government official, he didn't mind asking the king for his official assistance and his protection along the route. Verse 9, so I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and an entire cavalry with me. Really, friends, it looks like as if half the army of Persia accompanied Nehemiah on this journey. God had opened the heart of the king to protect Nehemiah. He knew that the hand of God was upon him. He went on his journey completely protected and secure. Quickly, remember what Ezra had asked the king when he asked for permission to return to the land. He wanted to ask the king for protection, but he had been so eloquent in telling the king how God would take care of him and how God would lead him, that he was ashamed to ask for an escort. He was afraid the king would say, aren't you trusting God? Nehemiah was different, however. He felt that he had the right to ask for protection because he was a government official. Now verse 10 of Nehemiah chapter 2. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. They were very much disturbed, the Horonite and the Ammonite official Sanballat and Tobiah. When Nehemiah reached his destination, there is already opposition. There are three people you're going to meet, friends. Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian, whom we are going to meet a little later. These three men were the enemies of God and God's people. They tried to hinder the building of the temple, and now they hinder the rebuilding of the wall also. When Nehemiah came with his enormous entourage of servants and soldiers, everybody in the country heard of it. They wanted to know who in the world this man was. They were told that he was cupbearer to the king of Persia, and that he was coming to help the Jews. When word got around, the enemy was grieved. They didn't like what they heard. It's always interesting to see how news is received, friends. It usually depends upon who you are, whether news is good or bad. Just think of it. The gospel is good news. But the gospel is not good news to its enemies. In fact, it is anything but good news. Verse 11. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few men. And I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts, that is, no animals with me except the one I was riding on. After arriving in Jerusalem, Nehemiah did not want to stir up undue alarm. So he went out at night under the cover of darkness to make his inspection and see what the real condition was firsthand. He did not take his entourage with him. It was not parade. It was a layman who meant business with God. Notice what he does. By night, in verse 13, I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, and there was not enough room for my mount to get through. There was so much debris that Nehemiah could not ride horseback. He had to dismount. Verse 15. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. Nehemiah had friends circle the entire city. Nehemiah had finished with his inspection. The officials did not know where I had gone, verse 16, or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews, or the priests, or the nobles, or the officials, or any others who would be doing the work. Now, friends, we have come to the end of our program. Nehemiah obeys God's word to the T.